She found the evidence, then she did nothing, for 7 days. She didn't find a text. She didn't find a receipt. She found a playlist. 47 songs on her husband's phone, a list called Cass Summer, and she only recognized 3 of them. 3 songs he had always sworn he hated. She was 7 months pregnant, standing barefoot in her own kitchen. And in the next 11 minutes, she read 14 months of messages that destroyed everything she thought was real. But here's what she didn't do. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't call him, confront him, or even move from that kitchen island. She put his phone back, exactly where she found it, walked to the fridge, got her yogurt, and ate it. Because Margot already knew something her husband didn't. She knew whose building that rooftop party was in. She knew whose name was on the deed. And she knew that the lavish celebration he was planning, 50 guests, $18,000 in flowers, imported champagne, was happening in a venue her family co-owned. She didn't cancel his reservation. She got dressed, and she went. The most powerful move isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes, the woman nobody sees coming is the one who was holding all the cards the entire time. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in that kitchen? And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it with them. It might be exactly what they need.
No, it was just a Spotify playlist, playing softly from a phone he'd left screen up on the kitchen counter. Cass Summer, it was called. It had 47 songs, and I recognized only 3. They were tunes Derek had always claimed to despise. It was just a Tuesday, late in August, and I was 7 months along with you. I was standing there by the island, feet bare on the cool floor, a hand pressed against my lower back, the other clutching a glass of water I hadn't taken a sip of yet. The sun was streaming through the window over the sink, hitting that perfect golden angle that always used to fill me with such hope. That day, though, it just made everything seem bleached and harsh. Too bright for the reality of it all. I reached for the phone thinking it was mine, but it wasn't. The screen was on, no password. Derek never locked his phone around me. I used to think it was a sign of his trust in me. Looking back, I realize it was just arrogance. The sheer confidence of a man who couldn't fathom his wife would ever have a reason to snoop. The first thing I saw wasn't the music. It was a text preview. Just a few words popped up before the screen went dark. Can't wait Saturday, see? I put the phone down. I picked up my water and drank the whole glass down in one go. Then I picked his phone up again. 3 times I locked and unlocked it. Just one more time, Margot, I told myself. Don't do it. But you have to, Margot. So, I opened it. The contact was just C-work. Gamla bostakomt. The conversation stretched back 14 months. I knew because I just kept scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. I stood right there at that kitchen island for 11 minutes, reading what was essentially the story of his second life. A life he was living right alongside ours. The messages weren't dirty, which somehow made it all feel worse. They were full of affection. There were pet names, private jokes, and pictures from dinners at restaurants I had wanted to try, places Derek had claimed he was too worn out for. I read it all without taking a breath, without moving a muscle. Then, near the top, I saw the latest messages. Derek, the Rosewood rooftop is confirmed. Private buyout for Saturday. 50 guests. They're doing the Krug and the full tasting menu. Her reply, you're insane. You didn't have to do all this. And his, you only turned 30 once. You deserve the world. I remember looking down at my belly, thinking, I'm 7 months pregnant with your child, and you're throwing a lavish party on a rooftop for another woman. I didn't cry then. That would come much later. In that moment, my mind did something I later described to your Aunt Patrice as going completely silent and incredibly fast all at once. It was like a computer trying to run a program far too complex for its system, trying to make sense of information it was never meant to handle. I didn't take a single screenshot. I didn't reread a single line. I just placed the phone back on the counter exactly as I'd found it. Face up, same position, same distance from the edge. Then I walked over to the fridge and got the yogurt I was about to eat for breakfast. I peeled back the foil lid and just stood there at the counter, eating with a spoon, staring out at our yard, the yard Derek had hired someone to landscape. The yard I had paid for. That last thought caught me off guard. I never really let myself think about our money that way, about my money, the family I came from. I was raised not to. My father, your great-grandfather Theo, had very firm beliefs about carrying your wealth with grace. He always said, the loudest thing in any room should be your character. And there my character was, standing barefoot, eating strawberry yogurt, and trying to figure out if my marriage was over. I didn't send a single text. I didn't make a single call. I finished my yogurt, rinsed the spoon, and set it in the dish rack. Because that's what you do, isn't it? When your world is quietly falling to pieces, you wash the spoon, you put it away, you just keep breathing. By the time Derek came downstairs at 7:45, all dressed for the office with his tie already done, I'd made coffee and was sitting at the table with my laptop open, my reading glasses on. I glanced up at him. "There's coffee," I said. He poured himself a cup. He didn't say a word about Saturday. He just kissed the top of my head. You know, the way you kiss someone when you've stopped truly seeing them. A gesture that's both loving and completely empty. And then he was gone. I closed my laptop. For a long time, I just sat there, in the silence of the kitchen, with only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rumble of a garbage truck outside. I let those ordinary sounds wash over me. Then, I picked up my own phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang just twice before a man's voice answered. "Margot, it's early." "Russell," I said, "I need you to get the prenuptial asset schedule, and I need everything you have on the Ellison Trust disbursement calendar." There was a short silence on his end. "Should I ask why?" he finally said. "Not just yet," I told him. "But you will soon." I ended the call. I rested my hand on my belly. You were already awake, already squirming around, doing that little thing I had started to think of as you knocking. It was as if you already knew you needed to make your presence known, like you were practicing for your arrival. "I've got you," I whispered, not out loud, but in that quiet place in my chest where words form. "No matter what happens, I've got you." The morning light was still pouring through the window. It still felt too bright, but something in the room had changed. It felt, strangely enough, like a beginning instead of an end. I couldn't have put it into words then, but I could feel it. That specific kind of quiet that comes when a woman finally finds the solid ground under her own 2 feet and realizes it had been there all along. You see, I hadn't been entirely honest with Derek about who I was when we got married. I had my reasons, or at least I thought they were good ones. But standing there in that kitchen, with a clean spoon in the rack and a secret big enough to swallow a continent, I started to see things differently. The very secret I had kept, to protect myself, was about to become the one thing that could save me. Your Aunt Patrice Davenport had known me since we were just sophomores at Whitmore College, 11 years by then. And in all those years, Patrice had observed 2 undeniable facts about her best friend. First, I never, ever cried in front of anyone. And second, when I called her at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, asking, "Can I come over?" Something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. She had the good coffee that brewed by the time my car turned into her driveway. Not the everyday stuff, but the French press she saved for true emergencies, the kind that required you to sit down and talk it through. I walked in through her side door, still in the clothes I'd slept in, my hair held up with a pencil. I was 7 months pregnant with you. I moved like someone who had just made a life-altering choice and was still feeling its immense weight. We sat at our kitchen table, facing each other. I told her everything about the phone, the playlist, the texts, and the party. Patrice just listened with that intense quiet she has, the kind that means she's using every ounce of her willpower not to interrupt. Her jaw was set, and her coffee cup sat untouched. She was in that zone she gets into when a situation demands her full, undivided attention and control. When I finally finished, Patrice just said, "Okay, okay, how are you?" "I'm fine, Ato." "Tuam," I told her. "No, you're not." "No," I admitted, "but I'm functional, and right now, that's what's important." I wanted to tell her that I had known, not the specifics, not like this, but that deep down, I'd felt that something was off. I kept trying to blame it on pregnancy hormones, or work stress, or just the fact that Derek had always been a man of extremes, and I'd married him knowing that. The truth was, I knew. I just hadn't wanted to be the kind of woman who had to know. What Patrice knew about my family's money was only a small part of the story. All Patrice knew was that my childhood was different. We had the family place in Connecticut, and my father, Theo Ellison, well, Patrice had a gentle way of putting it, calling it serious old money. I had a sensible car, I wore normal clothes, and I worked as an art consultant because I loved it, not because I had to. That's a kind of wealth in itself, honey, the kind that doesn't shout. What she didn't know was the full scope of it. Why a man like Russell Hart, with his 3 law degrees, managing a portfolio that spanned 6 continents, always took my calls before 8 in the morning. I never mentioned, sitting there in her kitchen, that Ellison Holdings was worth about $2.3 billion, or that my trust fund controlled 41% of it, or that the prenup Derek signed, after a 40-minute review with a lawyer from some website, had language he'd clearly never bothered to read. I didn't say it because my mother, Vivian, taught me one thing about money. You don't use it as a weapon unless your hand is forced. And Derek? Well, he had just forced my hand. Patrice asked, so softly, how long I thought it had been happening. The texts went back 14 months, I told her. 14. The math just clicked in my head. 14 months ago, Derek and I were just back from Portugal. I remember the sunburn I had, and he'd bought me this little blue tile from a market in Lisbon. It was still hanging in our hallway. Patrice then asked very carefully, "When did you find out you were pregnant?" 13 months ago. I saw it on her face, that tight, controlled look. So he was already... Yes, I said. When I told him about the baby, he was already with her. He held me while I cried, scared, and told me we'd figure it all out together. He said he was the luckiest man alive. And all the while, he was seeing her. The quiet in that kitchen was so heavy. You could hear the refrigerator hum. A bird hit the window outside. Just the sounds of a normal Tuesday. But it wasn't. Then Patrice said, "Honey, I've been holding my tongue for years." I looked up at her. She told me about all the little things, the moments she'd brushed aside, the way he talked about my job like it was some little hobby, or the way he'd talk right over me at dinner parties. Those little jabs about the house, the car, and how he always seemed so surprised when I knew something he didn't. "I thought he just thought I was being modest," I said. "No," Patrice said, so gently. "He thought you were less than you are. There's a difference." That hit me in a way I didn't expect. He never suspected I was hiding anything, because he truly believed there was nothing there to find. We just sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the one question I knew was coming. What are you going to do? I was quiet for a bit, just looking at my coffee cup, at my hands, anywhere but at her. I'm going to the party, I said. Patrice just stared. Saturday, I told her. The Rosewood rooftop, 50 guests, Krug champagne, a full tasting menu, all for a woman named Cassandra who's turning 30. Margot, she started. He doesn't know that I know, I said. And I want to keep it that way for one more week. Why? I picked up my cup. The coffee was cold, but I drank it anyway. Because some conversations, I said, are better had in public. Then as I was leaving, with my hand on her door frame, I asked her one more thing. Can I borrow that black dress? The one with the empire waist? Patrice looked at me for a long second. The Giovanni? Yes. But Margot, that dress cost. I know what it cost, I said. I'm the one who told you to buy it. The drive home was only 22 minutes, but in that time, I let myself remember everything I'd tried so hard to forget. I remembered introducing Derek to my mother for the very first time. Vivian had us at the garden house in Connecticut, which was her name for the 11-room cottage out back. She served tea. She was perfectly lovely, asked him all the polite questions about his life and his intentions. But later, when Derek was in the bathroom, she turned to me and said, so simply, he doesn't know, does he? It wasn't really a question. No, I admitted. When will you tell him? She asked. When I know he loves me, for me. She gave me that look, the one that saw right through you. That's not wisdom, Margot, she said. That's fear. You know the difference. And I did. I said, yes, I do. I really had meant to tell him. I had a whole plan, you know? After the first year, after we'd built something solid. But 1 year turned into 2, and then there was a wedding with a prenup that Russell drafted so perfectly, I barely had to look at it. The secret just became part of the structure of my life. I never lied to him about who I was, I just never told him the whole story. Was it wrong? I've asked myself that for years, but everyone I ever met who knew about the money first looked at me differently, like I was a prize to be won. Derek just looked at me like I was a person, a normal, sometimes stubborn person. I needed that so badly. But now I wonder if all I really did was create a man who thought he'd married beneath him, who saw himself as the provider and his wife as dependent. I had to stop that train of thought. I'd been sitting in my car in the driveway for 6 minutes. I could see the corner where Derek kept his golf clubs and the paint cans from the renovation 2 years ago. I paid for that renovation. He picked the colors. It seemed fair at the time. I went inside. He wouldn't be home for hours. I went to my office, the room Derek called my art room, with that kind of fond condescension you use for a child's playroom. I sat down, opened my laptop, and called Russell. On video. He appeared on screen in his office on the 38th floor of some Manhattan high-rise, in a room that looked like a library and a law firm had a very tasteful baby. A huge mahogany desk, 2 chairs I'd never seen anyone but him sit in. He was 62, but looked 55. He'd been our family's legal counsel for 23 years and had known my father better than I did. Sometimes he looked at me like he saw my dad, and I could never tell if he found it comforting or terrifying. Tell me what happened, he said, no preamble. So I told him. He just listened, you know? He had the emotional range of a marble statue. But when I was done, he asked, how far along are you now? 31 weeks. And the prenup? I need to know what he gets, I said. In the event of... I know what event, Russell cut in, turning to a file on his desk that was thick enough to be a novel. The short answer is very little. Your father was exceptionally thorough. The trust is separate property. Your own holdings are protected. Only the marital estate, what you built together, is subject to distribution. But you know, when it came to splitting things up, it was all so lopsided. I remember asking Russell, my lawyer, about our assets. There was the house, a few joint bank accounts Derek had put money into, which I had matched just to keep up appearances. A car, some furniture. The house, he asked what it was worth then. About 1.2 million, I told him. I'd made the down payment and paid for most of the renovations from my own discretionary fund. Russell just nodded. He said that even in a worst-case scenario, if a judge felt particularly sorry for Derek, he'd probably only get $200,000 or $300,000 and the car. I just stared at the wall in my art room, at that little Diebenkorn painting. Your grandfather bought that for me back in 1987 for $40,000. Russell liked to remind me what it was worth now, a number I tried my best to ignore. And if he finds out about the trust? I asked. He won't, Russell said so simply. But what if? I pushed. And that's when Russell looked right at me, his voice so quiet but so absolute. He signed a prenuptial agreement he didn't bother to read. He told me Derek had no right to the Ellison Trust, none to the holdings, and certainly no claim on my inheritance. The only things he could touch were the things I'd willingly shared with him, which, thanks to how we'd set things up, was almost nothing. I just nodded. Then Russell asked me what I wanted to do. I need 1 week, I said, for the party. It sounds silly now, but I told him I had to go to that party. I said to him, Russell, he threw a rooftop party for his mistress while I was at home. Pregnant. I'm not just going to let that slide. There was this long pause, you know the kind Russell does, where you can practically hear the gears turning in his head, weighing all the outcomes. Should I be concerned? He finally asked. I told him no, that I wasn't planning some big dramatic scene. I remember looking at that Diebenkorn again and saying, I want him to really see me. Just one last time before it's all over. I want him to know what he's losing. Russell thought about that for a moment. Do you need me to arrange anything? And I said yes. I wanted him to make everything about Ellison Holdings public. Press releases, that Forbes article from 2 years back, the board announcement from after my dad passed away. Everything. He asked why. Because he's going to Google me, I said, and I want him to find something. And then, my dear, Russell said something in that deadpan way of his, the kind of quiet statement that could level a city. Margot, he said, are you aware that the Rosewood Rooftop, the venue for Saturday's party, is owned by a group the Ellison Trust has a 43% stake in? I just sat there, completely still. Practically speaking, he went on, Derek has rented a party space in a building your family co-owns. You could, if you wanted, just cancel his reservation. I was quiet for what felt like a long time. I don't want to cancel it, I said. And he almost smiled. No, he said. I didn't think you would. I told him I wanted to go to the party. The rest of that day I spent in my art room, not painting, but making a list. Not of all the things he'd done wrong, but of logistics, as your grandfather used to say. Mom, I was setting the board before I made my first move. That Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I went through the motions of our marriage, like a musician sight-reading a complicated piece. It was perfect on the surface, but there was nothing behind it. I made pasta on Wednesday, a sauce that simmered for 40 minutes and made the whole kitchen smell of garlic. Derek got home at 7:30, had 2 helpings, said it was wonderful, and asked about my day with that kind of attention that means a person's body is there, but their mind is a million miles away. On Thursday, I asked him very specific questions about his work, the kind that needed real answers. Watching him scramble for them, I felt it for the first time. That deep, soul-crushing exhaustion you get from faking being relaxed for so long, you can't even remember what it actually feels like. Then, on Friday morning, I had my 31-week checkup. Dr. Caroline Merritt. She was such a calm woman. She had a way of explaining things that made you feel like you were part of a conversation, not just getting a lecture. She put that cold ultrasound gel on my belly and just watched the screen. Everything looks perfect, she said. Your heart rate was strong. You were measuring just right. Everything was good. I just lay there on that table, watching your little heartbeat flicker on the monitor. And I felt this thing in my chest. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't hope, but something else, something that didn't have a name yet. I drove home and told Derek what the doctor had said, that the baby was perfect, and her heart was strong. Great, great, he said, his eyes glued to his phone. I watched his face as he said it. You know, he never once asked about your name after we'd decided on it. We had agreed on it 2 months before that day. Eleanor. Eleanor Vivian Reeve. He helped pick it, and then it was like he'd checked it off a to-do list and just moved on, as if you were a task to be completed, not a person about to arrive. I had to stop myself from going down that rabbit hole. There would be time for that later. For now, I had things to do. On Thursday night, Derek had said he was going out for work drinks. He got home around 11. He smelled of expensive whiskey and some restaurant I'd never been to. I was already in bed reading, but I pretended to be asleep when he came in. It was funny how easy that had become without me even realizing it. After I heard his breathing even out next to me, I just lay there in the dark and let myself feel the true weight of it all. Not the anger. Not yet. I could feel that building up, like a storm gathering pressure inside me. But that night, I let the grief come first. That specific sadness for the marriage I thought I had, for the man I thought I'd loved, for all the years I'd spent making myself smaller, quieter, thinking that's what love was about. It wasn't love, of course. It was just damage control. That night, after Derek was asleep, I got out of bed and went downstairs. I can't really explain it, but I suddenly just couldn't be still anymore. The house was so quiet, but my mind was screaming, so I cleaned. I cleaned the entire first floor with this frantic energy of someone who can't fix the big things, so she focuses on the small ones. I scrubbed counters, reorganized the entire pantry. I even got down on my hands and knees, 7 months pregnant, mind you, and cleaned the grout between the kitchen tiles with a toothbrush at 11 o'clock at night. I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't stop. When I finally ran out of things to clean, I drew a bath. I didn't even know why. The cleaning had just burned through every bit of energy I had left. I didn't even bother to change. I just sat on the edge of the tub in my jeans and an old sweatshirt, put my feet in the hot water, and sat there. The bathroom tiles were this pale green color. I had picked them out myself. I'd driven 40 minutes to a special shop in Hoboken and spent 2 hours choosing them because I had such a clear picture in my head. They were the perfect color, and I had loved them every day since they were put in. And I remember thinking, I'm going to miss these tiles. And that, of all things, is what finally made me break down and cry. Not the party, not the 14 months of secret text messages, not his little playlist with 47 songs, not even the thought of his hand on another woman's back. All of that would have its turn. But the tiles, those pale green tiles I had chosen so carefully for a bathroom, in a home I thought I was building with a person I trusted. I cried for those tiles and for everything they stood for. I cried for a long time, quietly, the way you learn to in boarding school when the walls are thin. Then I washed my face, drained the tub, and went back to bed. And then there was Cassandra Whitmore. Yes, she deserves a mention. On Wednesday afternoon, I'd had Russell look her up, through ways that wouldn't leave a trace online, a little trick he'd taught me years ago that I never thought I'd need. She was 29 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, a marketing director for a real estate firm, not Derek's, but a similar one. That's probably how they met at some industry event. Her Instagram was tasteful, lots of travel, nice restaurants. It looked like she was close with her mom and two younger sisters. She had a master's from Ohio State, and in her pictures, she just looked happy. That was the part that really got to me. I wanted her to be some cartoon villain, so obvious and wrong that I wouldn't have to feel anything complicated. But she looked like a real person. The kind of person who either didn't know she was the other woman, or did know, and had told herself that what she had with Derek was special. Neither thought made me feel any better. In the end, I didn't hate her. I hated Derek for putting me in a position where I had to think about her at all. I wasn't losing my mind. I knew what I saw, and I knew the difference between a man. There's a world of difference between someone who falls into a mess and someone who builds one. Derek built this. He got the tickets, he made the plans, he sent those texts about deserving the world. For 14 months, he chose this every single day. That wasn't a slip-up, darling. That was a whole other life he was running right alongside mine. That Thursday, he was home for dinner, and I mean really home. He was putting in that special effort he always did when he was feeling a little guilty. It was a pattern I'd learned over 3 years. He poured the wine before I could ask. He even followed up on some little thing I'd mentioned days ago. He put his phone face down on the table. That night, especially, face down. He asked me, "How are you feeling, really?" I looked at him over the table, the candlelight, the wine, the pasta I'd made, this whole little play we were in. "Honestly," I said, "I feel like I'm on the edge of a cliff, like the world's about to shift." He just nodded, all serious. "Third trimester jitters," he said, "completely normal." I picked up my fork. "Yes," I said, something just like that. Later, while getting more water, he just dropped it in. "Oh, I have a client thing Saturday night. Big to do. You wouldn't want to come. It's all stuffy business talk. You should have Patrice over. Have a cozy night." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He'd told that lie so many times he didn't even realize he was acting anymore. I just smiled and said, "Of course, have fun." He looked so relieved, he had no idea what was waiting for him. On Friday, I called my mother. Your grandmother Vivian listened to the whole story without a single word. When I was done, she just said, "I see. That's it?" I asked. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something?" There was a pause. "Your father would be furious," she said, so carefully. "But he'd also say that anger is energy, and energy needs a purpose, not a tantrum." "I'm giving it a purpose," I told her. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not worried about you." After a moment, I asked, "Are you coming?" "To the party on Saturday? I'd like you to be there, Mom," I said. "Not for a fight, just... I don't want to be by myself when it happens." The silence on the phone was long, full of all the things a mother feels for her child. "Tell me what time," Vivian finally said, "and what I should wear." Saturday morning, at 8:17, I put on the black Chanel. I stood there, looking in the mirror, 7 months pregnant with you, my love, the empire waist, my hair pulled back. The dress was perfect. Patrice really did have an amazing eye. I just looked at my reflection for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and texted Russell, "We're ready." He replied in 3 seconds. Car is set. I'll be there. And then he added, because he'd known me since I was 12, your father would be so proud. I put the phone down. Let's go, I said to myself and to the little baby kicking inside me. The Rosewood Hotel rooftop was just as the text described. String lights were draped in these beautiful, long curves between iron posts. The city skyline was glowing in the distance, all amber and violet in that magic hour. It's the kind of light that makes everything seem more valuable than it is, and sometimes more lovely, too. White tablecloths on round tables were set around a little dance floor. 3 bartenders were working behind a bar stocked with Krug and big silver ice buckets. You could smell jasmine from the planters along one edge of the roof. There was this huge flower display against the far wall, all white and cream flowers cascading down. After 15 years in the art world, I pegged it at about $18,000, maybe more. 50 people, in their cocktail best, were already mingling when I got there. I wasn't on the list, but I didn't have to be. Russell, who'd been in the Rosewood's private club since 2009 and owned a piece of the building, had arranged it all with one call. His advice was, walk in like you own the place. In many ways you do. Don't look for him first. Don't look for her. Get a drink, stand by the edge, and let him find you. I walked up to the bar. The bartender was young and sharp. He looked at me, then my belly, then back at my face with that look people get when they're quickly adjusting their assumptions. Sparkling water, please, I said. Without me even asking, he put it in a champagne flute. From far away, I probably looked like I was part of the celebration. I found a spot near the edge of the roof. The view of the city was incredible from there. I could see the whole party without even turning my head. I waited for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. And then I saw Derek. He was by that enormous flower arrangement, talking with Graham Whitfield, his business partner. Graham was laughing at something Derek said. Derek was wearing a suit I'd never seen before. New, expensive, and definitely not from our closet. He looked so relaxed, lighter than I'd seen him in months. It was the lightness of a man who has finally set down a heavy burden. And I understood, right then, that the heavy burden was me. There it was, the thing I'd been trying so hard not to see. He wasn't relieved to be away from work, or from the stress of a baby on the way, or any of the other excuses he told himself. He was relieved to be away from me. In his world, I had become the chore, and she, whoever she was, had become the prize. I was the weight, and she was the release. I'd been somebody's burden, and never even knew it. I just watched him for 2 minutes, completely still. He hadn't noticed me yet. And then Cassandra arrived. She came up the stairs in a red dress that was, I had to admit, stunning. She was laughing about something. The whole party did that thing parties do when the guest of honor shows up. It just sort of tilted in her direction. Conversations shifted. People turned their heads. Derek turned, and his face. Oh, I tucked that expression away to think about for years. It wasn't just lust. It was something closer to relief. The kind of relief you feel when you've been holding your breath for a very long time and can finally let it out. He looked at Cassandra Whitmore the way a person looks at something they've already decided is worth any price. Cassandra was beautiful. I saw that the way you see that the sky is blue. It was just a fact. Derek walked over to her. He kissed her on the cheek, and his hand rested on the small of her back. My own hand, without me even thinking, went right to my belly. 7 months, and you kicked. Just one good, solid kick. Almost as if to say, I'm here, we're here, don't you forget it. I didn't. It was Graham Whitfield who saw me first. I watched it happen on his face. First confusion, then his eyes widening in recognition, and then the slow-motion horror of a man realizing what's about to unfold and having no idea where to run. He mumbled something to Derek, and made his way over to me. "Margot," he said, his voice all tight and strange, like someone trying to speak a language they barely know. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Hello, Graham," I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. "It's a beautiful party." "Yes, yes, it—" He stopped himself, trying to recalibrate. "Margot, I think maybe—" "Is there somewhere else I should be?" I asked him. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. "I'll take that as a no," I said. I took a little sip of my sparkling water. Graham Whitfield retreated. 30 seconds later, I saw him lean in and say something quietly to Derek. I watched Derek's face as he listened. Watched the change happen, the frantic calculations starting behind his eyes. Derek turned, and he saw me. He went absolutely still. It was the stillness of a man whose two separate lives have just crashed into each other in the same room. His mind was racing. You could see it. Was this an accident? Was this a disaster? How much did I know? When did I find out? He started walking toward me right away. I'll give him that. He didn't hesitate. I watched him put a mask on his face as he walked. By the time he got to me, he had arranged his features into something that looked like surprised delight. "Margot," he said, "what are you doing here?" I just looked at him. "I was invited," I said. "By, this is a hotel. Derek, anyone can come to a hotel." I glanced around the rooftop. The pretty lights, the jasmine, the $18,000 flowers. This is lovely. Whose party is it? His jaw clenched, just a tiny bit. I'd learned to read all his little tells over 3 years. That clinch was the one that came right before a carefully constructed lie. "A colleague," he said. "It's a work thing, I told you." "You said it was a client event," I replied, keeping my voice sweet. "Right. So, what's the client's name?" Silence. I let it hang in the air. That was another thing I'd learned, how to hold a silence and not be the first to break it. "Derek," I said, and my voice was as steady as a rock. "What is the client's name?" He said nothing, and in that quiet, in those 3 seconds that stretched on forever, while the lights twinkled and the champagne was poured, and 50 people laughed 15 feet away from us, I had this moment of perfect crystal calm. I wasn't mad. I wasn't hurt. For the first time in 3 years, I felt completely clear, like still water. He grabbed my arm, gently but with a firm grip. He started steering me toward the elevators, away from the party. His face had lost the act. This was the real one, the frightened one. A mix of confusion, and underneath it all, something that looked almost like relief that it was finally happening. "I can explain," he started. "I know," I said. "You don't have to." "Margot, I found your phone," I told him. "Right there in that quiet vestibule, with the party muffled behind closed doors. I read the text this morning. I know about Cassandra. I know it's been 14 months. I know you told her she deserved the world." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "Our daughter is 7 months along, Derek. You told another woman she deserved the world while I was home carrying your child." He had the decency, at least, to look like I'd physically struck him. The color just vanished from his face. "Margot, I'm sorry. It's complicated. It got—" "I know it got complicated," I said. "Everything gets complicated. That's a fact of life, not an excuse. I love you," he said. I said it so quietly. "Honey, please don't do that." And for a moment, he actually stopped. I told him we were going to talk, properly, but not there. "My attorney will contact yours on Monday," I said. "Until then, don't come home." He just stared. I turned to Margot and said, "I'm going back to the party." He asked why. I looked at him, really looked at the man I'd married, at that tie I'd never seen, the suit I knew nothing about, and the look on his face. He still had no idea what he was losing. Because I'm not the one who should have to leave. Then I walked back to that rooftop. I got a sparkling water from the same bartender, found a table near the edge, with a view, and just sat. I was 7 months pregnant at my husband's mistress's birthday party, and I felt a calmness that scared me. In my life, that kind of calm always came right before the world fell apart. Now, here's something I didn't tell a soul for years. I wept in the elevator on the way up before I ever saw Derek. Not in front of the guests, or Graham, or that kind bartender. It was just me in that elevator for the 43 seconds it took to get to the top. I remember pressing my back against the mirrored wall and just letting the tears fall, completely silent. It was a trick I had perfected at boarding school, where you had to learn how to cry without making a sound. Then the doors opened, and just like that, I stopped. I was always very good at stopping, but I later learned that wasn't always a good thing. Derek never came back up. I found that out from Graham, who walked over about 20 minutes later. He had the nervous energy of someone trying to disarm a bomb. He sat down with a whiskey he obviously needed. "Margot," he started, like he'd rehearsed a speech and then given up on it. "I want you to know I didn't know." I looked at him. "But eventually you did," I said. There was a pause. I watched him decide to tell the truth. "Yes," he finally admitted. "And you didn't tell me." "Yeah." "No." I just looked at him. "Graham, I'm not mad at you. I get it. I just need you to know that I know." He just nodded, looking miserable, and honestly, a little grateful to be told what to do. He asked if there was anything he could do, and I said no, just to enjoy the party. He left. I sat there by myself for the next 35 minutes. My mother, Vivian, was on her way. All the while, I had my water, the smell of jasmine in the air, and the whole city sparkling below me, completely unaware. And you know, what I found out later was that Cassandra noticed me, the birthday girl herself, 29 years old in her red dress. She saw Derek leave in a hurry. She saw the pregnant woman sitting alone, the one Graham had just had that hushed 8-minute confession with. She started asking him questions, and Graham, bless him, who was probably having the worst night of his career, he told her. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough. So Cassandra spent the rest of her own birthday party with a look on her face like she'd just realized the fairy tale she was living in had a very different ending. It's funny, I don't know how to feel about that. A part of me, the part I'm not proud of, wanted her to be some simple, awful person so my feelings wouldn't be so complicated. That part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Vivian arrived. My mother walked onto that rooftop at 9:15. She was about 40 minutes late, which meant she'd either stop to change shoes or have a drink. Or both, which was just as likely. At 62, Vivian didn't make an entrance. She just occupied a space so completely that you only realized later she'd been the center of it all. She came right to my table, sat down, and looked at me. "You okay?" she asked. No, that was the first time I'd said it out loud. Vivian just put her hand over mine. She didn't say a word, didn't offer any advice or her very strong opinions about Derek's character. She just sat with me. She let the silence be what it was, and sometimes that's the only thing that helps. We stayed like that for a long time, while the party buzzed around us. Toasts were made, food was served, and someone turned the music up too loud. Finally, at 10:30, I told her, "I want to go home." "Yes," she said, "I want to go home and sleep and just do this one day at a time." "Yes," she said again. "That's exactly right." I drove myself home. I told Russell I didn't need the car. I needed those 22 minutes alone, just driving through the city at night, with the radio playing on a station I hadn't touched in ages. I got home around 11. I couldn't go into our bedroom. I stood in the doorway, looked at Derek's side of the bed, and just turned away. I went to the nursery instead. It was the one room I had poured all my heart into. The walls were a soft white that took 4 tries to get right. The crib was built. The little bookshelf was filled with the first books I'd ever picked out for you. I sat in the glider chair by the window, right where the morning light would come in. I put my hands on my belly. It was 3 in the morning, and I remember thinking, this isn't how it was supposed to be. I had a picture in my head, not a perfect one, but a picture of something real. The 3 of us, in this room, becoming a family. And in that moment, that picture just vanished. I was sitting in the dark trying to imagine what came next. I had made myself small for so long, not because I didn't know my own strength, but because I wanted to be loved for me. The awful irony was that I hid so much of myself in the process. The man who chose me didn't choose me at all. He chose a version of me that wasn't real. He chose a woman he thought needed him. I never needed him. I wanted him, and that's a completely different thing. He never would have loved me if he'd known the truth. I don't regret it, though. I regret some of my choices, but never you. Not for a second. And right then, you moved. It wasn't a sharp kick like at the party. It was this long, slow roll. In the quiet of that nursery at 3 in the morning, it felt like an answer. It felt like company. Like you were saying, I'm here. We'll do this together. I stayed in that chair until the first light of dawn. Then I made coffee and drank it while it was hot. On Sunday morning, Derek texted, I need to talk to you, please. I read it, put the phone down, then picked it back up. I typed just 4 words. Monday through our attorneys. Then I put the phone away and went to water my plants. I had 17 of them. I watered every last one. I counted them as I went, which took about 40 minutes. It felt like a rosary, the way my grandmother used to run beads through her fingers. Not really for prayer, but for the steady, careful rhythm of it. Monday morning, at 10 o'clock, my lawyer, Russell Hart, called Derek's attorney. He used that calm, unhurried voice of his, the one that says he's already won and laid it all out. That I was proceeding with the dissolution of the marriage. That our prenup was ironclad. And that the marital estate was much smaller than Derek thought, since most assets came from a trust that was my separate property. He also mentioned that if things got messy, certain family financial documents would become public record. Philip Crane called back in 45 minutes. Derek had a few questions. Russell called to tell me about it. Specifically about Ellison Holdings, he said. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him it was a private family trust and that he probably should have read the prenuptial agreement a little more carefully. I was quiet for a second. How did he take it? His attorney said, and I quote, my client needs 24 hours. He can have 24 hours, I said, and hung up. I sat at my desk, and I remember noticing how the September light was different, cooler than it had been in August. Summer was finally letting go. At 2:15 that afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't pick it up. I've always had this silly superstition about it that 31 years of logic couldn't shake. But I answered. A careful, hoarse voice said, Margot, this is Cassandra Whitmore. I got your number from, well, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry, I can hang up. For a long moment, I didn't say anything at all. I just sat there, listening to the sound of her voice. Don't hang up, she'd said. I remember pausing, wanting to tell you something. It was Cassandra. She said she was sorry, that it was the only reason she was calling. She knew it might not change anything, but she wanted me to hear it from her. I just said okay. She told me what he had told her, that our marriage was over, that we'd already decided to separate, and were just sorting out the details. That was his story from the start, she said, her voice cracking a little. And that's what she believed. I stayed quiet. I know that sounds like what every woman in her shoes would say, she went on, her voice getting tighter, but I needed you to know I never would have. Not if I had known you were pregnant. Not if I knew there was a baby. Then she just broke down, saying how sorry she was. And you know, I believed her. I hated it, because it would have been so much simpler not to, but I could hear it in her voice. It wasn't an act. It was a real moment of reckoning for her. She wasn't calling to make excuses. She was calling because it had finally dawned on her, since that Saturday night, that the man she thought loved her was the kind of man who would lie to her just like he'd lied to me. We'd both been tricked by the same person. It didn't make us allies, not really, but it made us something. I asked her then, carefully, if he'd ever mentioned his finances, what he owned or made. There was a pause. She said he talked about his deals, his real estate projects. He mentioned once that his wife came from some family money, that it had helped them get the house. I let that sink in. I asked if he ever said the family name. No, she said, he never did. I asked her, he really didn't tell you? Tell me what? Nothing, I said. Just nothing important right now. Thank you for calling, Cassandra. I mean that. She asked if there was anything she could do, and I remember thinking, slowly, actually there might be. I called Patrice right after, sitting in my art room in front of that Diebenkorn. The afternoon sun was hitting the painting just right. It made the colors just sing. Your grandfather had loved that painting. I once saw him stand in front of it for 20 minutes without saying a word, the longest I had ever seen him be still. I told Patrice about the call. She was quiet for so long, I had to check my phone to see if we'd been disconnected. Finally, she said, "You're not going to do that thing where you forgive everyone and just absorb all the damage, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm done absorbing." "Good," she replied. "What are you going to do?" I told her, "I'm going to let Derek see exactly what he had, and I'm going to let the world see it too." I said it right out loud in that quiet room, just to the air. Sometimes you have to say the truest thing out loud to make it real. Somewhere along the line, I'd made myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I was done being small. That Tuesday afternoon at 3, Derek came to the house. He called first. He at least had that decency. He asked if we could just talk without the lawyers. I said yes, because I needed him to see the whole picture. Not for cruelty and not for revenge, but because he needed to understand what he had thrown away, the full scope of it. He showed up looking just terrible. 2 nights in a hotel, and whatever Cassandra had said to him after Saturday, plus the call with Russell's new information, had clearly shaken his whole world. He looked like a man who'd been running numbers in his head and hated the answer he kept getting. He sat at the kitchen table, and I sat across from him. He asked me what I needed, in this soft, appeasing voice I'd never heard from him before. It told me he'd already done the math. "I need you to understand something first," I said, "before we talk about what I need." He said, "Okay." I took a breath. "When we met," I started, "I was testing something, whether someone could love me separately from where I came from. It matters to me. It always has. My father left me in a position where I will never have to worry about money. I've never had to worry, and I spent my whole adult life just wanting so badly, to be loved by someone who didn't know that." Derek was completely still. "You passed the test," I told him quietly, "for a while. Margot." "I'm not finished," I said, and he stopped. "You passed the test, and then you stopped seeing me. Not the money, but me, the person. I became like furniture. And somewhere in that process, you found someone who still looked at you like you were special. And I get that. I really do. But what you did, throwing a lavish party while I was home, 7 months pregnant, that isn't a mistake. That is a choice. A choice you made every single day for 14 months. He didn't even try to argue. The man who had deflected and told me I was overthinking things for 3 years didn't defend it. I know, he said, so quietly. Do you know whose building that rooftop is in? I asked him. He blinked. The Rosewood? The hotel? I know, he said, and so I told him. I watched his face as the pieces fell into place. That was the moment I had been quietly building toward all week. Not for cruelty, but because I needed him to see the full portrait, the complete picture of what he had decided was ordinary and cast aside as not enough. His face went through emotions I don't even have names for. I watched him realize, right there, that the woman he'd treated as a minor character in his own story had been the author the entire time. How much? He started. It doesn't matter, I said. That's the thing. That's what I need you to hear. The number doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm a full person, with a history and a family and a life that is real and large. And I have been living in the margins of my own life because I was afraid to be seen as anything other than just your wife. And I am so much more than your wife. I always was. At the end, he asked if there was any way at all. I thought about it. I really did. I gave it the 3 full seconds it deserved. No, I said. I don't think so. The surprising thing was, I didn't feel sad when I said it. I just felt true. September came, and I moved through it with the kind of focus a woman has when she stops wasting energy on grief and channels it into building something new. Not destruction. I was done with that. The destruction had happened in the elevator, in the bathtub, in the nursery at 3 in the morning. Now I was building my next life with the same careful eye I used for acquiring art, patient, clear, with a long view. The legal part went faster than usual because the prenup was ironclad. Derek's lawyer came back within a 24-hour window with 3 counteroffers. Russell rejected each one with a specific politeness that basically meant the discussion was over. In the end, what Derek was entitled to from the marriage was his car, his personal belongings, 2 joint accounts he'd paid into, and a lump sum that my team correctly described as generous, considering his actual legal standing. He signed. He didn't fight. I suspected, and Patrice later confirmed, because Patrice always knew everything, that Derek had talked to Cassandra after our conversation that Tuesday, and Cassandra, having heard the name Ellison, had Googled it and showed him what she found. The Forbes article, the board announcements, the charitable foundation with my grandfather's name on it, the full portrait. I wondered what that must have felt like for him. I didn't let myself dwell on it. This wasn't a victory. I want you to understand that. In my own heart, this isn't what winning feels like. Winning would have been a marriage that worked. This was just landing. This was me landing on my feet, and I really do know, that not every woman in this situation lands on her feet. Some of them are truly lost. They have nowhere to go, no Russell Hart in their corner, no trust fund, no house in Connecticut. I think about those women a lot, even now. I'm not separate from them. I just had more cushion for the fall. That's not virtue, that's luck and inheritance. I try to always remember the difference. Derek's things were moved out on a Wednesday. He came with a moving company. I didn't watch from the window. I made tea and sat in the art room with my book, just listening to the sounds of drawers opening and boxes being carried, and the front door opening and closing over and over until it all stopped. That night, I reorganized my closet. Imagine, 2 in the morning, 33 weeks pregnant, and rearranging a closet in the dark with just one little lamp on. Derek's side was empty. I stood there for a moment, looking at all that empty space. Then I started moving things, methodically, deliberately. I spread my clothes out into the whole space. I moved every single item I owned, one hanger to the right, then two, and I just kept going until his side and my side were one and the same, until the whole closet was just mine. There were no longer two sides to anything. I stood back and looked at it. I had been squeezed into half of my own closet for 3 years. I spread back out into the full space, like a plant reaching for the sun, like something returning to its natural size after being kept too small for too long. On a Thursday morning, Derek's mother called. Nora Reeve was 64 years old. She had spent 30 years. You know, your other grandmother was the kind of mother who saw her son's faults clearly but loved him anyway, which I admired. But she could also use that love like a weapon, and that was harder to take. I had been expecting her call. I was ready for it. "Margot," Nora said, her voice sounding like a speech she'd practiced 3 times and was already giving up on. "I want you to know that I know what he did." "Okay," I said. "I'm not calling to defend him. He doesn't deserve a defense." "Okay." Then came that specific pause. You know, the one where someone searches for honest words. "Because I love that baby. That baby is my grandchild, regardless of what Derek did. And I am asking you, woman to woman, to please let me be part of her life." I took a breath. "Nora," I finally said, "I was never going to keep her from you. That was never a question." After a long moment, she just said, "Really?" I told her she is going to need all the people who love her. I am not going to subtract from that list. And, because of what her father did. When Nora spoke again, her voice had changed. It wasn't braced for a fight anymore. "He didn't deserve you," she said, so quietly. "I know," I told her, "but he gave me her, so I can't be entirely sorry." It's funny, Cassandra did something back then that I never asked her to do. In the second week of September, she sent a voluntary statement to Derek's lawyer. She laid out the timeline of their relationship just as she'd understood it. She even included how Derek had told her his marriage was over, that we were separating, that he was available. She didn't have to do it. The prenup handled everything, but it was the truth. And for her, having it on the record mattered. I remember Patrice asking me why she did it. "Because she needed to not be complicit anymore," I said, "even by accident. She needed the truth to exist somewhere outside of her own head." When Patrice asked if I felt bad for her, I had to think about it. "I feel adjacent to her," I said, "like we were characters in the same story, and neither of us was the author." I realized I deserved so much better, not because of my family or my inheritance, but simply because of who I was. I deserved someone who wanted to see all of me, every single part. The big picture and the tiny details, the legacy, and the woman who stood completely apart from it. I decided right then I would raise my daughter to know her own worth before she had to learn it the hard way. Before someone who was supposed to love her made her feel like that love had to be earned. By late September, at 37 weeks, Dr. Caroline Merritt slid that cold device over my stomach, looked at the monitor, and said, "Any time now?" I drove home from that appointment by myself. I had people, of course, Vivian, Patrice, even Russell in his own way, but I wanted that drive. Just 22 minutes of me, the radio, and the city. At a red light on Riverside, I finally put a name to the feeling I'd had for weeks. I'd thought it was anxiety or exhaustion, or even a new kind of grief. But it was relief. Not happiness, not yet, but a deep, profound relief. It was the kind of relief you feel when something that was always meant to break finally shatters, and you find the ground is still solid beneath your feet. The ground was still there. I was standing on it. The light turned green, and I drove home. And then you, Eleanor Vivian Reeve, were born on October 1st at 4:57 in the morning. It was after 14 hours of labor that Patrice later called both heroic and extremely loud. And she was right on both counts. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and flowers. Your grandmother Vivian had brought roses from her garden, wrapped in brown paper. Outside the window was that special kind of dark that happens right before the sky decides to become dawn. Vivian was in the waiting room. She'd been there since midnight. Russell Hart sent flowers, 3 dozen white peonies, because he had perfect taste and knew they were my favorite. The card just said, "Welcome, Miss Eleanor. The board is going to love you." Your father wasn't there. That was my choice, made clearly and without any anger. When labor started, I texted him, "I'm at St. Mary's, baby is coming. I'll send pictures." He wrote back right away, "Please let me come." I told him, "Not today. She'll know you. She'll have you in her life, but today is mine." And he respected that. At 4:58, Dr. Caroline Merritt laid you on my chest. 8 pounds, 1 ounce, a full head of dark hair, and these huge, wide eyes that already seemed to be taking in the whole room, the light, the sounds, the person holding you. "Hi," I said to you, and you just looked at me. I thought I would feel so many things right then. I expected love, but love is just a word until it lands on someone, and when it does, it's bigger than the word itself. I expected fear, maybe even some sadness, for the version of that moment I had once imagined, with Derek in the chair. The 3 of us making a perfect picture. I never expected this. I never expected to feel so complete, like my entire life had been leading me to this exact moment. Not the wedding, not the money, not my career, or the art, or the house. None of it. Just this. You, right then. That was what I had been moving toward all along. I held you for a long, long time, as the room buzzed around us with nurses coming and going. Dr. Caroline Merritt would check your readings, make her notes, and give me that quiet, professional smile of a woman who'd done this thousands of times, but still understood that for the person in the bed, it was the only time. At some point, Vivian came in, your grandmother, Vivian Ellison, who never cried, not at parties, not at funerals, not even at her own husband's memorial. Just stood in that hospital doorway, looked at her daughter holding her granddaughter, and wept. Not a polite little cry, but the real kind, the kind that had been waiting for just the right moment to be let out. "She looks like your father," Vivian said. "I know. He would have—" she started. "I know," I said again. We sat with that for a while, the weight of it, and the beauty of it, and how, in that moment, those 2 things were one and the same. 6 days after you were born, I was home. I was standing at the kitchen island, and the morning light was coming through the window over the sink. That same window, that same light, that same kitchen, where I'd stood 7 weeks before with a glass of water I never drank, and a phone that wasn't mine, and a future that was quietly falling apart in my hands. I was making coffee with one hand, and you were in the carrier on my chest. I know it was technically too early for that, but Dr. Caroline Merritt had given me an unofficial blessing, probably because she knew I was going to do it anyway. You were asleep, your mouth a little open, your tiny hands curled up by your chin. I thought about the last time I'd stood right there, about that playlist, Cass Summer. The text preview, And those 4 words, "You deserve the world." I looked down at you. "We're going to be okay," I whispered. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be exactly what we're supposed to be." You kept sleeping, the coffee finished brewing, and the light streamed in. I checked my phone just once. There was a text from Patrice asking how we were, a missed call from Vivian, and an email from Russell with the subject, "Fourth quarter board notes." I put the phone down. I poured my coffee, and I drank it. While it was still warm, I realized then that it was the first time in months I had done that. Just sipped my coffee while it was actually warm. It seemed like such a small thing, but honey, it wasn't a small thing at all. About a month after you were born, the Forbes article came out. It wasn't about me, not really. I've never been one for the press. It was a profile on Ellison Holdings because of a big donation we were making. The Theo Ellison Foundation was funding a women's entrepreneurship center at Whitmore College, where I went. The article was 6 pages long. It had a photograph of Vivian, me, and you. You were only 3 weeks old and couldn't have cared less. And it identified me as the controlling trustee of Ellison Holdings, daughter of the late Theodore Ellison, and the architect of the foundation's new strategic direction. I read it at my kitchen table with you, in your bassinet beside me. The morning light was perfect. I didn't feel triumphant or anything like that. I just felt represented. I felt seen, right there in print, by someone who had actually done their homework. You know, it was never about what I had, but who I was. For 3 years, I was Derek's wife. That was real, a choice I made and believed in, and something I truly mourned. But I was always other things too. I was Theo's and Vivian's daughter, I was Eleanor's mother, and I was a woman who always knew her own mind, even when I let others talk me out of it. I'm finished with that part now, the letting others convince me. Derek sent a text when that Forbes article came out. I saw his name, took a deep breath, and opened it. It said, "I read the piece. I had no idea. I mean, about the family money. Margot, I'm sorry." He knew it wasn't enough, but he said it. I read it over, then simply typed back, "Take care of yourself, Derek. And be good to her. She deserves a father she can rely on." I sent it, put my phone away, and picked up Eleanor. And that, my dear, was the end of that chapter. By November, Eleanor was 6 weeks old, and let me tell you, she had opinions. That's the one thing no one really prepares you for, the opinions. She had strong feelings about the morning sun in her nursery, the exact temperature of her bath, and which song I had to hum while walking the kitchen with her at 2 in the morning. Even the way her carrier strap touched her cheek mattered. At just 6 weeks old, she was completely her own person. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. And I've seen some extraordinary things, you know. I've bought art that literally took people's breath away. Been to auctions where one piece sold for what most people won't make in 20 lifetimes. I've been surrounded by genius and beauty and the weight of human creativity. But none of it, not one bit, came close to watching my daughter figure out she had a voice. We were at the big Connecticut house for Thanksgiving. Not the little garden house, but the main one, the one I'd stayed away from since Dad died because it was just too big, too full of him. But that fall, I knew it was time to go back, not to change it, but to live in it again, to fill it with our own new memories. Your great-grandmother Vivian was there, of course. She'd been there for days, already rearranging my kitchen. She called it improvements. But really, it was her staking her claim. Patrice and her husband James came with their 2 children, who promptly explored every single room, even a couple that had been shut for ages. Patrice kept apologizing, but Vivian was thrilled. Uncle Russell came just for dinner and was gone before we served dessert. That was so typically Russell. He had 2 helpings of everything and held Eleanor for exactly 11 minutes, having what looked like a very serious business chat with her, which was also classic him. Dr. Caroline Merritt couldn't make it, but sent the most beautiful flowers, the kind in those heavy, interesting vases, and Nora Reeve was there. That was my decision, one I thought about a lot, and every time I knew it was the right one. I remember watching her in a chair by the window, holding Eleanor and singing some soft, old, out-of-tune song. Maybe it was from Derek's childhood. It didn't matter. She was Eleanor's grandmother, and she deserved to be. Whatever Derek did was on his conscience. Nora's love for that baby was real, and it was Eleanor's to have, separate from my own heartaches. I was old enough to know that difference. Patrice came up beside me then, holding a glass of wine she'd been nursing all evening. You know, she said, most people in your shoes are still in the ugly crying stage 6 weeks after the baby. I told her, oh, I did my ugly crying in an elevator, a bathtub, and a nursery at 3 in the morning. We Ellisons are very efficient, you know. Patrice laughed, and then she asked the question she'd been wanting to ask for a while. Are you happy? I looked at her and really thought about it, the way Dad taught me to, all the way to the end, past the easy answers. I'm getting there, I said. It isn't a straight path. Some mornings, I make coffee, and I'm just fine. And some mornings, I make coffee, and I miss the life I thought we were going to have, the story I believed in. That's allowed, Patrice told me. Yes, I said. I know. I'm letting it be. Later that night, after the kids were in bed and James had cheerfully taken over the dishes, he'd long since made peace with being good at that sort of thing, and Vivian and Nora had found common ground over a second glass of a very nice burgundy, I took Eleanor to my father's study. It was the room I'd avoided the most. It still smelled just like him. His books, the faint scent of the pipe tobacco he'd quit 20 years before he died, but that never quite left the furniture. I still buy the same lemon polish, you know, because I just can't bring myself to change it. I sat in his big leather chair, holding Eleanor to my chest, and I talked to him. Not out loud, really, just a whisper, the way you talk to people who are gone when you need them to hear you. I found the wall, Dad, I told him. You always said I'd hit a wall. A moment where I had to pick between what was easy and what was right. I found it. I got through it. I'm still a little bruised, but I'm on the other side. Eleanor made that little noise she always made when she was drifting off to sleep, a sound that meant she was safe, and here and completely untroubled by all the grown-up messes. I know what I saved from it all, I continued. Not the hurt, not the anger, I don't want to carry that. What I kept is this. I know now that I deserve to be seen for who I am, hiding myself, making myself smaller. That wasn't safety. It was just fear dressed up as a good reason. The person who was supposed to see me chose not to. That was a terrible thing. But it's over now. And what I learned is that I'm the kind of person who always finds her feet. And I am going to spend my whole life making sure she knows she is, too. Eleanor was fast asleep then, her weight on my chest, so warm and solid. That feeling of complete trust. That's the real wisdom, honey. The prison door had been unlocked the entire time. I was just too busy trying to keep myself small to even notice it was open. I wrote a letter to Cassandra after that. I didn't send it for a week. I wrote it, read it, tucked it in a drawer, and then took it out again. I realized it wasn't about forgiveness for her or for me. So I rewrote it to say what it was really about, just seeing the truth. Dear Cassandra, it said, we were both left in the dark about different things. You didn't know about me, and I didn't truly know about him I hope you find someone who tells you the whole truth right from the start. Someone who celebrates you for everyone to see, not in secret. You deserve that. And so did I. We both do. I mailed it and never got a reply, but I didn't need one. By January, Eleanor was 3 months old and turning into a little person. She had this laugh, and she'd give strangers this thoughtful, judging look. No hostility, just pure observation. That was so much like my father, it made Vivian cry the first time she saw it. I started working again, just part-time, selectively. I had the freedom, you see, to work because I loved it, not because I had to. I took on a small project, a private collection that was being broken up. Important pieces, the kind of challenge I've always been good at. I met with the family's agent in some generic office on a Tuesday. The room had nice light, terrible coffee, and that old paper smell that always makes you feel like the things inside are very important. I laid out my strategy, my experience, my instincts. I spoke with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for 15 years and knew her own worth. When we finished, the representative stood up and shook my hand. "You're very impressive," he said. "Thank you," I replied. And I truly meant it. It wasn't a performance, not that carefully polite modesty I had worn for the better part of a decade. I meant it the way my father always meant things, simply and without apology. "Thank you." "Yes, I know." Then I got in my car and called Patrice. I got the acquisition. "I am absolutely shocked," Patrice said right away, completely stunned. "Oh, stop being obnoxious," I told her. "I plan to be obnoxious about this forever. You deserve the full obnoxious treatment." And I laughed. A real laugh, you know? The kind that bubbles up from somewhere deep inside and doesn't ask for permission. I drove home. Eleanor was with Vivian, who was doing what she called a grandmother audit of Eleanor's books, which just meant I'd find at least 6 new ones on the shelf when I got back, all from that one independent bookstore she's been trying to single-handedly support for 22 years. The January sun was coming through my windshield, so different from that harsh August gold of that morning only 7 months before, when I stood in my kitchen with a glass of water I never drank, watching my life come apart at the seams. It's funny, you know, after all this time, the little things you remember. I can still see the light from that evening. Over just 11 minutes, it softened and stretched out, the way it only does when a season is sure of itself. It wasn't harsh or blinding, just honest. It was just enough light to see by, enough to find your way forward. I remember pulling into the driveway and just sitting for a minute. Not like that time in August when I was frozen, completely paralyzed by it all. This was just a quiet pause, a natural breath between what was and what was next. It was that moment right before you open the door to the life you've been so carefully building. I thought of the woman I'd been 7 months before, standing there in the kitchen, barefoot with a secret that felt as big as the whole world. I thought about all the things she didn't know then, and what I was finally starting to understand. I'm the kind of person who lands on her feet. I always was. I just let myself forget for a while. I let someone else's small idea of me become my own limit. I was done with that, done with playing small. I was the whole person now, all of it. The success and the art, the trust and the heartache, the grief, the mother, the daughter, and the woman who drove 40 minutes just for pale green tiles because she knew her own mind. That was all me, and I was going inside. And so I did. The door closed, and from the nursery, I could hear Vivian's voice, reading aloud in that wonderfully serious tone she saved for books she truly approved of, which was the same sincere tone she used for everything she valued. And I could hear you making that little humming sound you always made when you were listening intently. I set my keys on the table and walked toward those voices. I walked toward my life. And you, Eleanor, you grew up knowing how deeply you were loved. You grew up knowing your own name and all the strength it held. You grew up in a house with those pale green tiles and your little corn picture on the art room wall, and a grandmother who read to you as if books were the most important thing in the world. You grew up knowing that your mother had once stood very still at a kitchen island and made a choice. And that choice, my love, was you. The story I'm telling you, every piece of it was lived and felt so deeply. I hold on to it because it taught me about truth and love, and those are the lessons you keep with you your whole life. I'm so glad you're here to share it with me. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being a part of our community.